Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Seth Brown. I'm with the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, and today we'll be hosting a webinar on true source control. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go through a little bit of introduction, housekeeping type of information, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of what we're going to be talking about and who's going to be talking. So just real quickly, I want folks to know up front that PDHs will be available, 1.5 PDHs specifically. You can request that by emailing me at the email address that's shown there. That email address will be provided at the end of this session as well. If you have any questions, we're going to be doing questions during a question and answer session at the very end. We might do one or two quick clarifying questions as we go along for each speaker or set of speakers. But I think we're trying to hold most of our questions towards the end. So please use the question function, and we'll be reviewing and compiling those questions as we go along, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please send your questions anytime as we go along. If you look in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar app that's on your screen or it's on your computer, there is a PDF there of a compilation of all the slides that are going to be shown today. So please feel free to download that anytime you want to. Note that we are recording this session, and when this is done, we're going to post this within a couple days, maybe a week, to NMSA's YouTube channel, and we'll provide information on a follow-up email when we're done. And lastly, we're going to have a few poll questions at the end of this introduction section, so just as a heads up on that. Before we get going too far, I want to provide a little bit of information on NMSA, the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, for those who are not familiar with us or may be new to the Alliance. We are a 501c3 that's focused entirely on the MS4 sector. We are a coalition of state and regional organizations. We also have we have individual MS4s that have joined, as well as affiliate members, corporate members, that type of thing. We were established in 2016, and we got our IRS approval in 2018, so we're relatively new. And you can see our motivation for formation and organization, and our vision for the organization listed there. We are really focused, like I said, on the MS4 sector. We want to drive the topic of stormwater forward. We want to raise the profile of stormwater. We want to unify as much as we can the different programs across the country as a unified voice. They're all different, of course. Don't want to unify that much. And raise the awareness and the public image of stormwater. That's so a communications section is what we're really focused on too. And our vision is simple. We want to help provide clean water for the country, just like many other organizations. And you can see all the states in blue in this map. Those are all of the states that are part of the Alliance at this time. So we've got, like I said, 24 states, over 4,000 MS4s that are part of that larger network that are affiliated with these states. So if you want more information, please visit our website there. This website will also be available at the end of this session as well. But on to today's topic and theme. We are talking about true source control. There's a couple of thoughts I just wanted to throw out there in quotes, often kind of generate some of these thoughts. So the first is from Barry Commoner, who said environmental pollution is an incurable disease. It can only be prevented. So what we're talking about today, a lot of it is on pollution prevention or elimination entirely from our environment. Easier said than done, obviously. There's also a great book if you have any other deeper interest in this, which is called The Search for the Ultimate Sink. It's ironically the author's name is Joel Tar, since we're going to be talking about coal tar sealant elimination systems, or programs. But you can see a great quote from Mr. Tar there about the fact that environmental issues are holistic and they're connected. So when we're looking at different media such as water, there's always a connection to other media. So if we have air pollution, becomes water pollution, and land, obviously soil contamination can become a water issue as well. So they're all interconnected. And so these are some things to think about when we're talking about thematically what we're going to be talking about today. But I think in a sunnier perspective, I'll say, or more a more positive or constructive perspective, is the fact that the most effective water quality management approach is to eliminate pollution from the environment in the first place. So that's really what we're talking about today. Some questions that we're going to be considering as we go along. What is true source control? What is that? How does that differ from other source controls? So what is it and what is it not? What's the state of it? What's the research is going on in this area? How is it being applied? Where is it being applied? What are some real world examples and where do we go from here? So that's what these are the kind of questions that we're hoping to address. So with that in mind, I want to pass everything over to Rachel Urban with EPA to talk about kind of the EPA perspective on true source control. Go for it, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Seth, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. So I'm Rachel Urban. I'm the lead for the Stormwater Permitting Program at EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. And I'm also joined by my colleagues, Lisa Biddle, who is the chief for the municipal branch that includes the stormwater program that I'm in, as well as Heather Goss, who's the National Transportation Liaison between EPA and the Federal Highway Administration. So they're going to be coordinating on the question and answer session a little bit later along with me. So in the past, when I've spoken about controlling stormwater, most people really think of controls that can be inserted into storm sewers or built in the ground to reduce stormwater pollution. But as we all know, people who work with stormwater permits every day know that the pollution prevention measures are equally important components of any stormwater program. And in fact, as you're probably aware, Phase 2 MS4 permits include pollution prevention and good housekeeping as one of the required 6 minimum control measures. So we in the stormwater permitting program are interested in finding solutions to stop pollutants from coming into contact with stormwater and going beyond that to reduce or prevent the generation of those pollutants in the first place. And that's something that the speakers you'll hear from today are likewise focused on in their efforts, and I'm really excited to hear more about today. It's often more cost-effective to prevent the pollution from being created at its source than to pay for the control, treatment, and disposal of the wastes after they're created. And when less pollution is created, there are fewer impacts to human health and the environment. And focusing on prevention is an important piece that is certainly worth exploring together. And there are really a lot of people who have a role to play in this, including my colleagues and I here at the federal level, as well as at the state level, local governments, transportation industries, industry groups, and environmental groups, just to name a few. So we've been interested in national approaches to eliminate the need for municipalities, industry groups, and others to have to broach these issues alone. And today I wanted to quickly highlight one effort that we've been working on in the stormwater permitting program, and then share information on the program here at EPA that's related to source control. So hopefully by now you've heard of the 2015 Memorandum of Understanding on Copper Mitigation in Watersheds and Waterways that EPA signed along with industry groups that were associated with vehicle suppliers and automotive aftermarket and automakers and the Environmental Council of the states. And we shorthand this to the Copper Free Brake Initiative. And it really was focused on getting copper and some other constituents out of brake pads. And I'll admit that it didn't take a lot of convincing for us to realize how beneficial this partnership could be for communities and waterways across the country, and how wonderful a model that could be for other industries interested in similarly reducing their environmental impact. There were a lot of benefits that I wanted to note really quickly to working collaboratively under that MOU, which can also, I think, serve as a model to be replicated for other possible voluntary approaches to really address environmental concerns, especially those that involve source control or pollution prevention. And the voluntary commitment to meet the same reduction targets for copper and other pollutants in brake pads so nationwide provided a lot of efficiencies for manufacturers, as well as saving regulator resources by not having to approach challenges in a piecemeal fashion. It's also enhanced collaboration among many different groups, facilitating a good way to better understand limitations and objectives while finding creative ways to really address the problems that can work for all parties. And I would say that an MOU or a similar means also provides a transparent way to voluntarily bring people together to address source control efforts, to reduce stormwater pollution, and improve our nation's waters. So this framework also provided a very consistent way to address the problem while providing certainty to those who manufacture, supply, sell, and use brake pads. I also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight another program at EPA. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, EPA has a P2 or pollution prevention program. And through this program, there are actually grants that are available to provide technical assistance to businesses to help them develop and adopt source reduction practices. And as you can see on the bottom right of the screen, EPA also has a Safer Choice program, which helps consumers, businesses, and purchasers find products like cleaners and detergents that perform and contain ingredients that are safer for human health and the environment. And these products can ultimately go down storm drains or be directly discharged to water bodies and end up in the environment. And products like power washing detergent can be discharged directly. So Safer Choice certified products will break down quickly and pose a lower level of concern. So I'll close by saying that we are supportive of these sorts of efforts that can really serve as a model for others interested in a source control type approach to reduce pollutants and protect the environment. And we're really looking forward to continuing to talk about this important topic and hearing what source control opportunities others have thought about as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Seth.
Thanks, Rachel. And we'll hear more from Rachel later and other EPA colleagues. So here's a quick review of the agenda, and others that are going to be speaking are here. You've heard from Rachel and I, but you'll also be hearing from Karen Cowan, who's the Executive Director of the California Stormwater Quality Association. She'll be talking about the definition of the problem or the issue. We'll hear about research updates from Sarah Hobby with the University of Minnesota, and we'll hear some anecdotes and some success stories from Randy Neeprash of the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition, as well as Karen, again, talking about what's going on in California. And lastly, like I said, we'll have a pretty robust Q&A session, facilitated discussion with all the panelists, including Rachel and Heather Goss, as well as Lisa Biddle with EPA. So if you've got your questions for EPA, this is an opportunity. So I'm going to move on with our poll questions, two quick poll questions that we have, which is on affiliation. So we want to know, we've got about 152 people that have joined. We want to know what your background is. We're always trying to reach MS4 program managers as much as possible. We always want to know who else we're reaching. So please take a second to let us know who you are and what your background is. So make sure that we're reaching the right audience. And we'll take a second for that. All right, it looks like I will close this poll, and most folks have voted. And I will share the poll so we can see who do we have here today. So we've got most folks are from the public sector. We also have a lot from the private consulting world who also support programs. So it looks like we're reaching the audience we want to reach today. So that's great. That's great. One last poll is to understand where you're coming from. What's your background or your knowledge, your level of knowledge of true source control? So we'd like to know, do you have a lot of background? Are you an expert? Do you know very little, nothing at all? Having some information on that is really helpful, again, for us to know if we're reaching, we're talking about the right topics, frankly. Okay, we're at about 70%. Okay, it looks like most of you have a limited amount of knowledge or a fair amount of knowledge. So I'll close this and I'll share this so folks can see this as well. And it looks like, again, so where most of us are in the middle. None of us, a few of us are experts and few have very little knowledge, but most of us have some knowledge or at least a fair amount of knowledge, which is great. So it's good. Looks like there's an opportunity for learning here today, which is great. Excellent. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to start with our presentations with Karen Cowan with CASCA, the California Stormwater Quality Association. And Karen, I'll push the slides, so you tell me when you want me to move forward. Okay.
Thanks, Vanna. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Cowan. I'm the Executive Director of the California Stormwater Quality Association. Like probably many of you, we are an association comprised mostly of, well, actually, I guess mostly of municipal members, phase 1 and phase 2 programs. We also have construction, industrial members, and a lot of affiliate members as well, wastewater, drinking water. We have a lot of folks who are in our association with over 2,000 individual members. So I'm glad to talk to you today. True source control is something that we've done for a really, really, really long time as an association, and I'm happy to sort of share our perspective. So go ahead next there, Seth. So what is true source control? The word true used to trip me up when I sort of started working in this area, because I would always say, well, what is false source control? If we're saying this is true source control, but what it's really getting at is sort of the difference of, there's different kind of source controls we talk about, right? And it's even baked in, as EPA noted in the introduction, in the minimum control measures in our permit, right? Generally operational source control, non-stormwater controls, et cetera. So go ahead and click next there, Seth. So typically, here's, a street sweeper. Sometimes when people think about source control, this may be what they're thinking about, right? So the street sweeper's out, it's collecting trash, it's collecting even some of the dirt and particles where metals might be adhered. So that is one kind of source control. But when we talk true source control, we're talking about, and I had found a good introduction from Rachel on the copper brake pads using for us. This is one of the big things that CASCA did, and I'm going to talk about it more when we talk about our success stories. But we had looked for a while, copper in our waterways. Where is it coming from? So it's the difference between it's already on the streets and getting into our waterways versus it's the brake pads is the significant source of it. So how do we reduce it at the actual source? So that's where the word true comes in. So we're talking about true source control. We're talking about getting to the actual source of the problem itself, rather than trying to sort of scoop it out of the environment once it's there. Next slide. So why do we need it? So if you think about how our permits are written and the world we've all lived in for a long time, it's, BMP, BMP, BMP. And if you take that sort of to its practical endpoint, if what we're talking about is treatment, right? In a BMP, we're talking about something that's scooping pollution out of the environment because it's sort of already there. So do we want treatment on all our water bodies everywhere for all pollutants? No, even if that were feasible at that scale, that's not what everybody wants, right? Big infrastructure on all water bodies everywhere for everything. Or do we want to find what the source is and remove it before it enters the environment? So go ahead and click next there, Seth. And what we're really talking about is treatment and removal. Oh, go back one. Versus the solution and fixing the problem. So that latter part, again, on true source control, why we need it. So we're not going to treat our way out of this problem, right? That's something I know Scott Taylor says a lot, and I think it's a great talking point. Stormwater's job is not to treat our way out of pollution. What we really want to do is figure out what the problem is and fix it. And that's where true source control is so, so powerful. Next slide. All right, so how do we go about achieving it? Go ahead, click next. So one way to do it is pollutant by pollutant. And each one of these dots, you could put tens of hundreds of thousands of more dots on there, right? If we really, for all the different chemicals that are in the environment, the ones we know about, the ones we don't not yet even know about. So we can, and that's kind of to date what we've really done. Where we've done true source control is really looking at it from a particular problem, a particular pollutant, and trying to tackle it one by one. It's effective, but it's not big picture effective, right? Because it's very time intensive and resource intensive to go about this sort of one pollutant at a time. If you click next. So one thing we've started talking about, and I use this word very gingerly, is trying to figure out a way that rather than having to always go at this pollutant by pollutant one at a time, again, with thousands and thousands and thousands of chemicals out in the environment, doing it a little more holistically. So how do we take all of those pollutants and sort of gather them up in one sort of process? And then the waste side of the environment, there's extended producer liability, right? That's where people have additional liability of where their waste goes, right? Rather than just having the consumer having to always deal with it. Same general kind of concept of how do we take this again from a water perspective and figure out how do we make sure we have a better system in place rather than having to tackle it pollutant by pollutant, that we're kind of preventing it in the first place, and what incentive do we have and what accountability do we have for folks to make sure that their products and chemicals aren't winding up in our waterways causing significant problems. Ultimately, I think probably both are really important. We're not going to ever get away from the individual pollutant side, but we do need to add that more holistic approach. So it probably sounds all well and good, but there's a lot of other things we need to consider. It's not, nothing is ever so straightforward. There's a lot of factors that we need to think about when we're looking at true source control. One is our goal accurate? And I use the word goal on purpose. It could be, is the water quality objective the right water quality objective? We do have places that, in fact, even some things we're working on right now where the water quality objective is significantly out of date. So is the problem a water quality objective problem? Is it a source problem? Is it both? But if you're going to solve the source, you need to kind of make sure that that goal is right. And back to sort of one of the things that Seth had said in the introduction, these are not siloed, right? Our world is all interconnected. So is your goal just this one particular contaminant? Is it something bigger? Is it interconnected to something? Like what is the actual goal? What are you trying to solve for? And knowing that and being clear about that's important. You also need to make sure your science is actionable, right? So if you're gonna go down the true source control path, it's a heavy lift. It's a good lift. It is the solution lift, but we need to make sure that the science is actionable. Another important part to consider are our permits and regulations. This is something in California, we are trying really hard to crack this nut. And I'm sure lots of you are in the same boat too, is that we can talk about solutions and what we all need to do, but then our permit, it's almost like there's amnesia between solutions and we get to the permit, and our permits are taking us down different paths, a more infrastructure path, and it isn't bringing along these other concepts with them. So we need the true source control to really be baked into the permits and the regulations and valued as solutions, because if they're not in the permits, the things that require us to do things, we're going to continue to have this big disconnect. Another concept to think about is, are we creating a different problem, right? So I'll use pesticides sort of as an example. If we went about pesticides on an individual pesticide by pesticide problem, the overall thing is people have pests they need to control, right? So if you're just solving an individual pesticide by pesticide, you're just shifting it from one pesticide to another, and you're not really getting to this ultimate problem. So if you're looking at solving toxicity and coming up with a better approach, hopefully then what you're doing is you're not shifting it from one pesticide to another, you're creating a more holistic approach that's making sure you're solving that toxicity problem. So, and then time and political will. Underpinning all of this, true source control takes time, it really does. And having the political will for folks, depending upon what the actual pollutant may be. It might involve industry, which means there's a lot more stakeholders and a lot more discussions to get from point A to point B. So those are and can be heavy lifts, just things to consider. Okay, next slide. All right, so what opportunities do we have? So this webinar is a great example of trying to sort of spread the gospel, so to speak, right, of what true source control is and why we need it. It's also something I think when you talk about with people, it's easy for folks to get their head around. You know, do we want pollution in our environment that we're trying to go around waterway by waterway to remove, or do we want to figure it out and keep it out of the environment in the first place? And that really resonates across the board with pretty much everyone when you really think about it, right? So you've got the local nonprofits, even wastewater here in California. We're partnering with our sort of sister agency that does the wastewater association here, where it's very vital to them as well. Drinking water, everybody, our regulators, everybody thinks this is a really good idea. and we're trying to educate the general public in this level as well. At the state level, all of us can do something. You can take action specific to what might be of high priority in your state, but also at the federal level. So again, I'm really glad we're having this webinar, because I think some of these solutions, again, we can do state by state, but some of them, it will help when we sort of band together and create a stronger voice to make some of these solutions happen. Okay, next slide. So what can you do? I always, like to have a slide on like what's actionable, what can you do? Being here in the webinar is a great thing, right? So we're all sharing and learning together, and then you can help educate others as well, spread the word, get folks involved, talking about solutions, right, rather than treatment. Shifting your own thinking. If you've been in this field for a while, it's really hard sometimes to, break out of the same way we've done things, and everybody around you talks about it the same way too. It's a challenge sometimes to sort of pick your head up and remind ourselves, what we're really trying to do is solve the problem rather than treat it, and to really rethink how we approach some of our stormwater programs. Building partnerships. Again, we have lots of potential partners out there locally, within your watersheds, statewide, nationally. The more we build the partnerships, the more we can get these solutions in place. And my little pitch for the regulators, again, back to the permits and the regulations, recognizing and allowing for true source control to be valued, so we can move some of these solutions forward. All right, next. And that's just my contact information. I know Seth is sending out the slides, so if you have any questions, just want to make sure you had my contact information. So that's it for me.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Karen. That's a great way to kick things off, so appreciate that. And again, I don't see any questions come in. We are getting more and more folks. We're up to about 170 people that have joined us today. And just for those who have joined us a little bit later, please provide your questions in the question area as you think of these questions. And again, we're going to have about at least 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at the end, so to have a discussion and have a focus on the questions that you pose. So please send those in as we're going along. That'll be very helpful. And you can see Karen's information up here. And again, a PDF of these, all these slides are available in the handouts area of your GoToWebinar app. So now we're going to move on to hear about what's going on research-wise from Sarah Hobby. Sarah's at the University of Minnesota. While we switch over, do you want to give a little bit of background where you're coming from, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everybody for attending, and thanks for inviting me. I'm a professor in the Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior Department at the University of Minnesota. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training. I kind of came at this stormwater world because of my interest in cycling of nutrients through plants and soils. And so I'm going to talk about source reduction in urban watersheds to improve water quality. And I'm going to focus primarily on phosphorus today, because phosphorus remains the most important cause of impaired water quality in freshwater systems where I work in the upper Midwest and in many other parts of the country and the world. And I think phosphorus actually raises some really interesting issues related to source control, building off of what Karen was talking about. So to put phosphorus into the context of source control, I'm going to subject you to my crude cartoons of a watershed, and I'm contrasting an urban watershed on the right and a natural watershed on the left. And I just want you to think a little bit about differences in how phosphorus cycles through these different kinds of watersheds. So in a more natural or less human dominated watershed, we might have new inputs of phosphorus from rock weathering and deposition. And then phosphorus, there are opportunities for phosphorus to be retained and transformed as it cycles through soils, through riparian areas before it enters streams. And then there's further opportunities for retention of that phosphorus as it moves down through the watershed and is taken up by biota in the stream, and also further opportunities for phosphorus to be retained in wetland areas within the watershed. Excuse me. So exports of phosphorus from the watershed into downstream water bodies is really influenced by how phosphorus is cycling through that watershed. So we can contrast that. Excuse me, I just don't have any water in my office with me. We can contrast that with an urban watershed where, again, we have inputs. These are probably enhanced because we have potentially fertilizer inputs of phosphorus. We may be importing phosphorus in food. And then that phosphorus is going to be entering the storm drain network, which is really different from the natural watershed because that storm drain network is very dense. It reaches high up into the watershed. So there's a lot less opportunity for retention as phosphorus makes its way into the storm drainage network. And then there's much less opportunity for retention as that phosphorus moves through the storm drain network into the surface water. And so, of course, then we end up with less retention of phosphorus in the watershed potentially, and more phosphorus inputs into our downstream water bodies, which is why we have impaired waters in these systems. And so the traditional approach to addressing this is to try to use structural control measures, so various BMPs to try to reduce to increase phosphorus retention before that phosphorus has a chance to enter the water body. But if we're thinking about source control for phosphorus, I'm going to argue that we need to think about it sort of at two different scales. And I think this relates back to what Karen was talking about. So, true source control is really focused on trying to reduce phosphorus inputs to the watershed. And I know there are a number of places where there are restrictions on phosphorus fertilization and use of phosphorus in fertilizers, for example, in lawn fertilizers. And we have that kind of true source control in the state of Minnesota, where we have a restriction on lawn phosphorus fertilizer. But I'm going to argue that I think we also have to think about source control at the scale of the street. And that's because we have a number of different processes that move phosphorus into streets, regardless of whether we have restrictions on phosphorus inputs to the watershed on phosphorus fertilizer. And I'm going to focus today on street trees as a source of phosphorus to urban stormwater. And I suppose that we could think about true source control in terms of removing street trees, but I think that there are enough benefits that we get from trees in urban systems, and including street trees, that that's not really an acceptable solution. So I'm going to be focusing instead on street sweeping, which we'll get to. So I just want to step back a little bit and talk about the importance of street trees as sources of phosphorus to streets and stormwater. So we know that trees can reduce stormwater volumes through interception, evapotranspiration, and also promoting infiltration of phosphorus in soils. But at the same time, they can have the net effect of increasing nutrient loading, because trees can increase the concentration of phosphorus in stormwater. And the reason that street trees are so effective at moving phosphorus into streets is because trees take up phosphorus from the soil. They invest a large amount of phosphorus in their leaves. And when trees change color in the fall and drop their leaves, or in the summer in California, they reabsorb about 50% of that phosphorus, but the remainder drops with the litter fall, and a component of that is going to go into the street if you have trees growing adjacent to streets. So trees adjacent to streets really act as nutrient pumps, where they move phosphorus from soil into streets, and then there's very little opportunity for that phosphorus to be retained on the flow path into stormwater, and then ultimately into surface waters that we care about. And it's not just in the autumn that trees do this. So I like to remind people that trees are dropping material into streets, all throughout the growing season. So in the spring, they're dropping flowers and bracts, the things that hold the buds or encase the buds. Then they'll be dropping seeds, and then in autumn or at the time of peak litter fall, obviously we get a lot of leaves coming into the street, but there is litter fall entering streets throughout the different seasons. So first, I'm going to talk about evidence that street trees contribute significant nutrient pollution to stormwater. Then I'll talk about the potential for enhanced street sweeping for phosphorus removal, and then talk a little bit about a recently developed street sweeping credit in Minnesota for phosphorus removal. So starting with the evidence that street trees do contribute a significant amount of phosphorus to stormwater. We've been pulling together data from a number of different agencies that have been collecting data on phosphorus export in stormwater, and I want to acknowledge those organizations here. This shows a publication or a result from a publication that was led by a postdoc, Ben Jinke, just comparing the event mean stormwater total phosphorus concentrations across different watersheds as a function of the fractional tree canopy cover over the street. So each of these points represents a watershed, and what we've done is basically plot the average stormwater event total phosphorus concentration for that watershed against the average tree canopy cover over the streets in that watershed. And so you can see that tree canopy cover ranged in these watersheds from 0 to about 45%, and that there's a strong positive relationship between phosphorus concentration in stormwater and tree canopy cover. Here we're diving in and looking at a single one of these watersheds across the season. And so again, this is in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I'm not sure if I said that, sorry. So we have a pronounced snowmelt period that is associated with a peak in phosphorus concentration. But then we see a second peak in phosphorus in the spring. And this is the time of year when we're getting a lot of those flowers and seeds being dropped in the street. And then again, in the fall, we see a peak in stormwater phosphorus concentrations associated with leaf drop. I want to highlight a study that was done by Bill Selbig in Madison, Wisconsin. And what Bill did was to set up a paired catchment study in a residential neighborhood. So there was a small residential catchment that just received the regular street sweeping. And then he had a test catchment with similar canopy cover where he augmented the street sweeping to basically do weekly sweeping and leaf removal all the way through the growing season. And what he found was that street cleaning greatly reduced the total phosphorus yield from the catchment. This was particularly true in the fall, but there was also a reduction in the spring and summer. So all told, I think we have a lot of evidence that street trees are an important source of phosphorus pollution to stormwater. And so we've done a couple of studies to evaluate street sweeping for phosphorus removal. And these studies have been partnerships with various groups between the University of Minnesota and in one instance, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, funded by the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. And then we've also partnered with a number of cities. So our first study was a partnership with the city of Prior Lake. And then we partnered more recently with the cities of Minneapolis, Roseville, Shoreview, and Forest Lake. And I want to give a big shout out to these cities for being so cooperative in these partnerships. So I'm just going to show a few key results from these studies. And all told, across these two studies, we partnered with cities to actually sample their street sweeping events. So we collected nearly 600 sweepings and analyzed them for phosphorus as well as nitrogen and carbon. I'll just be focusing on phosphorus today. Again, we had 5 cities. We sampled street sweepings in 3 different years. The sweeper routes ranged from 0 to 30% tree canopy cover. We sampled across all of the snow-free seasons and across a diversity of sweeper types. So there were mechanical broom sweepers and regenerative air sweepers, as well as vacuum collectors represented in these samples. And these cities were sweeping at various frequencies. So these are just some data showing the total amount of phosphorus that was recovered in sweepings. And this is expressed in pounds of phosphorus per curb mile. Each of the points represents a sweeping event. And so here what I've done is basically pooled all the data from all of the sweepings across all of these cities, using a diversity of sweeper types, swept at different frequencies. And there are a few things that I want you to take home from this slide. One is that we see higher phosphorus concentrations at certain times of the year, particularly in the fall. So in Minnesota, that's the time of year when leaves are falling, so October and November. We also see relationships between canopy cover and phosphorus recovered in sweepings at particular times of year. So again, in the early summer, so in June, and then again in the fall, you're starting to see a hint of that in September, but the relationship is more pronounced, or we have a steeper slope in October and November. We don't see much of a relationship when we look in the midsummer, July and August, when we don't have as much material coming into the street. And so we see important seasonality, and we also see an important role for canopy cover in influencing the amount of phosphorus recovered in sweepings. But there's still a lot of variation in phosphorus coming into streets that we can't explain, which will become important later on. This graph just shows the proportion of the total phosphorus in sweeping loads that was coarse material greater than 2 millimeters, which was primarily litter from trees. And you can see that in the autumn. So in these 2 months here, October and November, that about 70% of the litter fall is this coarse material. So it's coming from leaves. So tree litter fall is dominating the material that's swept up, particularly in the fall. I'm going to show you one slide from our Prior Lake study where we were actually able to quantify the cost of phosphorus removal through street sweeping, because we were able to do careful accounting of the capital costs, the depreciation, the fuel costs, the labor costs associated with street sweeping. So we could actually calculate the cost per pound of phosphorus removal of street sweeping. And I'm contrasting here two different routes. So a sweeper route that had low tree canopy cover, close to zero, and then a route that had about 20% canopy cover over the street in the dark blue line. And you can see if you look at the dark blue line that at certain times of the year, so in the spring and early summer, and then again in the fall, the cost per pound of phosphorus removed was $100 or less. So very inexpensive compared to a lot of structural control measures. So this makes the point that if we sweep in the right place, so in high canopy neighborhoods and at the right times of the year, street sweeping can be an effective way of keeping phosphorus out of streets and out of stormwater. So the advantages of enhanced street sweeping, where we're sweeping more frequently at particular times of year, are that it's cost effective for phosphorus removal, again, if it's targeted appropriately at places where there's a lot of leaf litter coming into the street and at times of year when that's the case. And there's also potential sort of ancillary benefits in that street sweeping can reduce solids loading downstream and also reduce downstream BMP maintenance needs. But there are barriers to enhanced street sweeping that I want to acknowledge. It can be hard to time relative to leaf drop. So particularly as communities have responded to insect or pathogen and pest outbreaks like emerald ash borer and before that Dutch elm disease, communities are planting more diverse tree canopies in cities. And they often drop their leaves at different times of the season. And so it may be important to do, repeated street sweeping in order to get all that material or a good chunk of that material off the street. It can be inconvenient for residents if there's, not off-street parking. It requires capital investment in sweepers. And what I want to touch on today is that there's a lack of state certified credits for MS4 permittees for street sweeping. And so I want to just spend the last part of my talk talking about the street sweeping credit that was recently developed for street sweeping for phosphorus removal in Minnesota. And so this was an effort that was done as a partnership between the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, particularly Mike Trojan and Dave Fairburn, and they basically worked with us to develop a credit based on our data that was both grounded in the data, but that they felt comfortable with from a regulatory standpoint. And originally we had, thought that we might be able to develop statistical models to predict phosphorus removed in sweeping based on things like tree canopy cover and time of year swept and frequency of sweeping. And what we found in our research was that there was just a lot of more variability than we had expected. Too much variability really for the regulators to feel comfortable with. And so we went to a different approach, which is a measurement approach. And so this measured approach basically recognizes that, if you know the sweeper load mass and you know the concentration of phosphorus in the swept material, that you can use that to calculate how much phosphorus is recovered in sweeping. And so in this crediting approach, permittees are able to either measure the sweeper load dry mass by measuring the wet load mass and getting some estimate of the moisture content, or just measuring the wet mass and using basically our data to assume a moisture content. Similarly, permittees are able to estimate the sweeper load phosphorus concentration based on our data. So they can specify whether they're sweeping in the fall, in which case there's a higher phosphorus concentration assumed, or in the rest of the year where we have a lower phosphorus concentration in swept materials. And this is a conservative estimate in that instead of using the average or median phosphorus concentration from across all of our sweepings, we use a 25th percentile phosphorus concentration. Alternatively, permittees are allowed to take a modeling approach where they basically enter the road miles swept, and then that is fed into the P8 model, which gives an estimate of phosphorus removed through street sweeping. So this is just an example of the credit calculator that Tetra Tech developed for MPCA for use by permittees. So I haven't given you sort of all the subtleties of this in this talk, but basically permittees can enter information either on the load dry mass or the load wet mass. There's also an option to do analyses of the organic matter content of the swept materials, which we found is very strongly correlated with phosphorus. Alternatively, if they want to use a modeling approach, they can enter curb miles swept. And then the calculator spits out a phosphorus load reduction that can be used in the permit process. So this is just an example that I developed from a couple of our routes where we know how much phosphorus was recovered in sweepings because we analyzed the phosphorus directly. And then I've compared that to the estimates that we would obtain using this calculator, either based on the load wet mass, which is the dark blue bar, knowledge of the load wet mass, and the organic matter concentration, which is the green bar. And then the purple bar is the P8 model estimate of P removal. And so you can see that all of the estimates are lower than the measured P recovery. And again, that's because the permit the calculator was designed to be conservative in estimating P removal through sweeping. And you'll also notice that the P8 model, it does not do a great job at all of estimating how much phosphorus or reproducing how much phosphorus is recovered in sweeping. So I'm just going to end by pointing out some research needs or future directions. So I definitely think we need to improve our models of street sweeping for phosphorus removal. That would greatly help the development of these kinds of credits because, of course, that's less burdensome on the permittee. I think there's also opportunity to quantify the benefits of removal of solids and other pollutants through street sweeping, and also of street sweeping for the removal of solids and other pollutants, and also the benefits for downstream BMP maintenance. And I think we also need to think about sort of handling swept materials in a whole systems perspective. So, what do we do with that material? In some places, there's good composting opportunities and facilities. So we can actually then bring that material back to residents so they can reduce the need for phosphorus fertilizer inputs to their residential landscapes. But I think that's something that we can explore further. So I'll stop by just acknowledging our city partners who are key in this effort, our funding sources, and then my collaborators on this work. I especially want to call out Larry Baker and Jacques Finlay from the University of Minnesota and Mike Trojan from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, as well as our Tetra Tech collaborators. So I will stop there.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. There's a number of questions that have come in, and real quickly, before you get out of all your stuff.
Am I still sharing my screen? Okay.
Yeah, you're still sharing your screen. One quick question. You just mentioned composting, and a question came in about what do you suggest if there's no composting available other than landfills? What would be an option?
Yeah, I think that is that's a really good question, and it's a tricky question because what we don't want to be doing is basically having this one way sort of pathway for where we're basically removing phosphorus from the landscape and putting it into a landfill. So I guess I would say that over the long term it would be good to try to develop those composting capabilities. So I know a number of municipalities take street sweepings, especially the autumn street sweepings, which are dominated by leaf litter, to commercial compost facilities. And then there are programs in place that either bring those to distribution sites where residents can obtain that compost, or residents can access those composting facilities. So I guess I'm not really answering the question, but I think that's what you'd really want to be striving for in the long run.
It's a tough question to answer, I think. So it's not easily addressed. So we've got other questions, Sarah, that we'll be posing to you in a few minutes when we get to the Q&A. But before that, and I thank you for your presentation, of course,
Thanks
Sarah.
so much.
Yep, thank you. So we're now going to go to another section, which we're going to talk about success stories. And we're going to start off with Randy Neprash, also from Minnesota. Happens to be my home state. That's not why we have a couple people from here. It's just it's where the research and activity is going on right now. So Randy, if you're ready, I'm going to share my screen, or make you the presenter, I should say, so you can share your screen.
That sounds good, Seth.
Excellent.
There we go. So you should be seeing my slideshow now.
We got it. Go
Excellent.
for it.
Okay. So as Seth said, I'm Randy Neprash. I'm a civil engineer. I'm speaking from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I am the vice chair of NMSA. I also am the staff for the Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition, and I'm work with Stantec Consulting. You've heard about two different approaches to source control. True source control from Karen in California, the copper brake pads or coppering brake pads is a great example of that. And then removing a source of pollutants through street sweeping. I want to talk very briefly about work done in Minnesota on a third approach, which is using bans or restrictions on one or more products that are pathways for one or more pollutants to enter the environment. Those bans can be executed at the local scale, the state level, or even the national level. We've done this in Minnesota with two examples. One is phosphorus in lawn fertilizer, and another is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, in coal tar sealant. So as Sarah said, the nutrient we chase here in Minnesota is phosphorus. And with lawn fertilizers, we knew two important things. One was the lawn fertilizers are a significant source of phosphorus in stormwater and in our local water bodies. And also that most residential lawns really don't need additional phosphorus to thrive. So that translated into some local restrictions on phosphorus in lawn fertilizer. In most cases, no phosphorus in the fertilizer. We had John Barton and James Johnson from the Three Rivers Park District did an excellent paired watershed study in two communities, suburbs of Minneapolis, where one community with a fertilizer restriction, one without. And what they found was even with relatively small storms, less than an inch, they were seeing significant phosphorus export from lawns, and limiting the lawn fertilizer resulted in significant reductions of that phosphorus export, 12 to 16% for total phosphorus, 24 to 34% reductions for soluble reactive phosphorus. So the conclusion was restricting phosphorus in lawn fertilizer can be an effective, but also a very low cost best management practice for reducing phosphorus in the environment. So with all that information, lawn fertilizer restriction became statewide law in Minnesota. It was passed in 2002 and became effective in 2004. What I'm showing here on this slide is a report done by a legislative analyst in the state of Connecticut about 10 years ago, showing that 11 states back then had passed similar sorts of fertilizer restrictions for phosphorus. Minnesota got there before everybody else. We're always pleased with that here, but a number of states did it. This only goes up until 2012. I honestly don't know if other states have adopted this, but it's good to see that there is some national implementation of this idea. With that, I'm going to move on to talk about PAHs. We found significant amounts of PAHs, a set of carcinogenic compounds in the sediments of constructed stormwater ponds, which then makes dredging those ponds just extraordinarily expensive. This problem was first found in Austin, Texas. There's great research on this done by Barbara Mahler and Peter Van Meter of the US Geological Survey and Judy Crane at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And that research found that coal tar seal coat is a principal source of these PAHs in urban and suburban settings. The mechanism, the seal coat is applied to pavement. It wears due to weathering and abrasion from tires. You get dust on the pavement that is then washed off into water bodies through our stormwater systems and into lakes and streams. Bad stuff. So again, we started with local bans on the sale and use of coal tar seal coat, and within a few years, we moved to a statewide ban. This, at all levels, this was fought very vigorously by the Pavement Coating Technology Council. Excuse me. These folks even came out for local city council meetings on occasion, but they certainly lobbied very vigorously at our pollution control agency and at our state legislature as well. This is a map from a wonderful website done by Tom Ennis out of Austin, Texas, called coaltarfreeusa.com. You can see the address at the bottom of this slide. Statewide bans have been implemented in the states of Washington and Minnesota, as well as the District of Columbia. They've been adopted and won't come online for another year or more in New York and Maine. There are restrictions on the use by governmental agencies in California, Illinois, and Connecticut, and there are very limited bans and restrictions on the use of coal tar seal coat in the state of Massachusetts. So, and then the various pins represent different types of local bans and restrictions in mostly cities around the United States. There was very recently, this is as of a news article from late January of this year, a ban was put forward in the Virginia state legislature. It was again fought very vigorously, this time by the Virginia Manufacturers Association, and it failed in January of this year. So this idea has legs, but it's still an uphill struggle, let's say. And with that, I am done, and I will hand things back to you, Seth. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Sorry, I was muted. That's interesting. I'm here in Northern Virginia, in the Washington D.C. area. I didn't even know about this ban that you talked about, the Virginia. One quick question that came up is some state. It looks like there's some states that have adopted this, but localities have adopted this. Is there a governance pattern here, such as whether you're a Dillon rule state or a home rule state? Is it just easier to get something passed at the state level versus the local level that you've seen or you've heard about?
I would say one of the ways to look at this is how vigorously product bans are resisted by trade organizations. And as you rise in the governmental hierarchy, the resistance to these ideas from very effective and very influential trade organizations increases significantly. So this was more difficult to do at the state level than it was at the local level. That was our experience in Minnesota. I expect that it would be just about impossible to do at the national level. I think that's the answer to the question.
Okay, there has been national level legislation on this, as you know, and that was fairly contentious too. So
Yep.
You're right. It's more to be said on all of this. I do also know there's an East Coast, West Coast type of thing too with the prevalence of coal tar, but I believe that's true.
There's
right?
a line at about the Continental Divide in the Rocky
Right.
Mountains. West of the divide, there's much less coal tar sealant. It's almost entirely asphalt based. But east of the Continental Divide, there's a lot more coal tar sealant, and the difference between the two in terms of PAH concentrations is about 1,000-fold.
Right. So there's a regional or geographic focus here or aspect to consider. So, okay, so this is a Midwest, East Coast thing primarily, it sounds like. So, okay, well, thanks, Randy. We should move on to our last speaker here before we move on to the Q&A session. So Karen Cowan, coming back up. Thanks for being available again. And I will mute myself, but I'll be moving the slides around. So feel free to kick things off, Karen.
Thanks, and I'm going to be kind of quick here, Seth, so that way we can reserve our time to get into
we have plenty of time though, so take your time, okay? Don't be too quick, we want to hear this stuff.
All right, so Casqua has a vision for sustainable stormwater management. It's on our website. If you're interested, I'm more than happy to send you the link. Our board adopted in October 2020. Go ahead and hit next there, Seth. And it has 4 key principles in it. And under principle 1, it's sort of what I call the stuff that we do, the actual programs that you would implement. And we have 3 primary things for us in California that we focus on for advancing sustainable stormwater management. One is maximizing stormwater capture, and the other one is minimizing pollution through true source control. So this is really, really, really for us such a big deal that it is one of the biggest parts of our entire vision of how we get to sustainable stormwater management. Go ahead, Seth, next slide. All right, so we've been doing this, as I noted in the beginning, for quite some time. And I want to talk through sort of different approaches that we've had. And you've heard a bunch now about copper and brake pads. So we were working on this stuff, oh gosh, probably 20 more years ago. And we worked actually from a legislative solution to have a change to the composition of copper brake pads. And that was signed into law in 2010. So what that legislation required was copper brake pads to have no more than 5% copper by 2021. So we actually just crossed that threshold very recently. And the state of Washington at the same time had done something very similar. So that's a legislative approach. It was a big uphill haul, even in California. Again, as sort of Randy was talking about, when you get to some of the trade organizations, obviously you're talking about brake pads, you're talking about some of the automotive sector. So, but we were quite successful. We've seen significant reductions of copper in the waterways in California. So again, sort of proving the point that rather than trying to come up with BMPs in all of our water bodies everywhere for copper, the solution was very, very, very effective. While we were working on the copper issue, we were also looking into zinc, another metal that we find in our waterways. And because it was pretty much an uphill haul, at the same time, sort of concurrently, what was happening in California is a new set of regulations, the Safer Consumer Products, was passed and put into law, operated by the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, it's a lot easier to say. So the idea for the safer consumer products is that if we think that there's something causing harm in the environment, either to the environment or to us as humans, what can we do to have safer alternatives? So we created a petition to DTSC for zinc because the tread in motor vehicle tires contains a high concentration of zinc, and we were connecting that again in our urban environment to concentrations that we were seeing in waterways. So that is actually in progress right now. That petition is to DTSC, and it's going through, again, that process. And this is more of a regulatory solution, again, rather than a legislative solution. And what's interesting to me about the DTSC process is rather than us saying, this is the exact solution, we're saying, here's the problem, we can make this connection. And then it goes through this process, this very public process to sort of vet that, make sure that that's really true, and then it's on to the tire industry actually to work with DTSC if they find that it is indeed true, to basically kind of come up with an alternative. And then there's a discussion from there. Is there an alternative? Is the alternative reformulating tires? Is there, just working through that whole process? And I think that's a really great way to go about it, because when you're talking again about the legislative solution, it can be really hard if you're saying, here's the problem, here's a solution, and everybody's butting heads and there's a lot of politics involved. You don't remove the politics at all when you get to the regulatory process, but I think it provides more of a working body where everybody is more collaborative than just a straight legislative solution. Pesticides is something we've worked on for a really, really, really long time in California. And again, we've had more regulatory approaches in this arena. So in California, in addition to sort of EPA's regulation, we have the Department of Pesticide Regulation in California. So as municipalities, we are actually legally prohibited from interfering with the sale and use of pesticides. That is really DPR's responsibility. So what we have done for a really long time working with DPR is making sure when they register a pesticide for use, also with EPA as well, that we're looking at aquatic toxicity. So, sorry, my camera flipped out there for a second. And again, I sort of mentioned this before. So rather than saying, diazinon caused toxicity, so we'll ban diazinon, which did occur, right? We're looking again at toxicity. So how do we make sure that what DPR says people can safely use does not cause aquatic toxicity? And DPR has been a fabulous partner over time. They've created a really, really robust modeling approach related to aquatic toxicity to use their model to make sure that if they're going to register something and say it can be used in California, that it is, again, it's not going to end up with that toxicity. So that goes back to sort of, remember that initial slide of pollutant by pollutant versus sort of a holistic approach. For pesticides, that is a really great way in the holistic approach to really kind of capture everything. So again, we're not going after each individual pesticide. Is it not causing toxicity? We're really holistically trying to prevent that aquatic toxicity in the first place. So to really formalize that more and to bring in sort of the local level, more, not what we would call true source control, but more the operational source control with the MS4s and integrated pest management, the state of California is working on some statewide regulations for pesticides that is hopefully, we're hoping, is really going to formalize a lot of this process more, again, with the ultimate goal of getting to the part where toxicity is not caused by pesticides. We have a lot of other things under consideration and some other things that we've sort of actively been talking on. Just yesterday, I participated in a roundtable hosted by EPA on tire particles. So from a microplastics perspective, tires, here we go back to the tires again, tires in the cars. What are we going to do about microplastics and the science pointing to tires as a significant source of those microplastics? So it's very interesting to me when I sort of look at the work that we've been doing, and there's a lot of strongly urbanized areas in California, but back to that whole car, right? Like we need the cars, we need the tires to go around, right? So how do we protect our waterways? How do we connect these true source control issues and protect our waterways, but at the same time have very safe cars? So these are not easy things to do. And it's going to take a lot of work of everybody collaborating together to kind of come up with some solutions. The other thing I would say, the successes that we have had are really starting to get people to really, again, holistically think about true source control and why it really, 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 really matters. I'd say we're getting to a point where I think it's starting to tip in a good way, where it's not just a shouting into the darkness and getting little changes here or there. I'm really seeing it happen at the elected level, at the local level, at the state level. People are really starting to shift their thinking. So I'm hoping that as we go on, we can come back and continue to share more and more success stories with you all. All right, Seth, I'll wrap it up there so we have time.
Excellent. Thanks. That's a great presentation. So much to cover, honestly. And you mentioned, Karen, stay on, please, because I think we want everyone to so we're going to be going on to our panel discussion. So if everyone can turn on the cameras, that'd be great. And Karen, you mentioned you hope that there's going to be more to share, right? And that's great. Because I failed to mention this in the beginning, but I'll mention it now, that NMSA is looking at doing a series of these webinars. So because there's so much to cover in this area, right? So if you're open to it, we will invite you back if you want to share more. And it sounded like there was an open discussion. Also, I wanted to ask a quick question that came in before we get going in the larger discussion, which is there's copper and zinc and anti-fouling paints for boats. And the question is, are you looking at this because of obviously the tie to aquatic toxicity in that context? So it's not just a land use thing, but there's also products in that context. Have you guys gotten into that area at all, Karen?
As CASPA, we haven't, but in my former life where I worked for the County of Orange, they have Newport Harbor. And that is a very specific issue that they have been dealing with, and very much looking at the copper anti-fouling paints. And I'll tell you what's really fun and interesting when you talk about politics. When you start talking about harbors and boats, you start getting into different tax
Right.
brackets and sometimes the actual politicians themselves.
Right.
So that actually got really politically contentious because it's, it makes good sense until someone's talking about my particular boat. But yes,
So that is a thing, but it's something you guys haven't gotten into, it sounds like.
As an organization, no. I mean, it's in the harbors of that absolutely. I mean, there's no question that the anti-fouling paints are a significant source of the copper yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Randy, looks like we don't have a raise hand feature, unfortunately, so I appreciate the physical hand raising.
I'm using the primitive methodology.
Yep.
Karen's comments reminded me of another really interesting success story that's still underway here in Minnesota, and that is salt. We're finding more and more salt concentrations rising in rivers, lakes, but also groundwater as well. And a lot of it is coming from road salt, and a lot of it is coming from home residential water softeners. And we're using source control ideas to approach that. So many of the road authorities are using all sorts of innovative methods, upgrading their equipment, and changing kind of public expectations so that we're using much less salt on the roads. It's still a question of automobile safety, but we can use less than we did in the past. And then we're using different approaches to reduce home water softening, also to reduce salt. So those are source control methods that are proving to be very effective.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I want to come back to that, but before doing that, I wanted to ask, and Sarah, there's a number of questions for you, so we'll get to that in a second. But Rachel, I was wondering if Heather and Lisa want to join in. That's fine. That's great too. That'd be great. Just kind of curious what you guys. I mean, as you're seeing this, do you have any thoughts from the EPA perspective as a response to what you're seeing? And I'm not going to go anywhere about permits or this and that. Just like, what do you think? What are your thoughts on what you've seen?
I'll kick us off, and Rachel and Heather should feel free to weigh in as well. Thanks, Seth. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the remarks we've heard today really highlight the importance of this is not just a stormwater problem and really looking upstream and the importance of that. So one thing that we're focused on at EPA right now is within our stormwater program, we're trying to coordinate more across programs. So we are talking a lot with our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, OCSPP. We're kind of in the early stages of building partnerships with them and getting to know all of their programs. They're responsible for administering the pollution prevention, or P2 program. And that's under a different legislation than we work under the Clean Water Act, right? So that's the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. And so their program, is to establish a source reduction program, which collects and disseminates information and provides financial assistance to states as well as others. So they have the P2 program, which we've talked about, which has a grant program, and they also have the Safer Choice program. And then, the NIPT Stormwater program, of course, is under the Clean Water Act, and we have the pollution prevention component in our MS4 permits, but that's sort of end of the line. So we do think about ways of preventing exposure, of stormwater to pollutants, but we really think that there's some opportunities for us to, work across programs. And we've been kind of chatting on the side, like, I hope we can get those guys to maybe participate in one of your future webinars. And I'm also hearing some really important connections with the TMDL program, which is also out of our Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds. So not the permitting program, but certainly those requirements come into permits. So I see some opportunity to talk more sort of across our stovepipes at EPA and bring folks together, because this is a program that, or an effort that I think once you look upstream, we could really be more effective. Go ahead, Karen.
Old school, raise the hand. I'm glad you actually mentioned the TMDL program. So I started my career 20 some years ago in the TMDL program and spent a long time there. And it was recently when I thought about what we're doing with true source control, and I was like, you know, it's really actually in some ways part and parcel to what, if you're doing a good TMDL where you're not under a consent decree deadline and just, you know, blazing through, one of the key parts in a TMDL, right? It's not just stormwater, right? It's, if we have a water quality problem, what is the source and how do we fix it? And then somehow when we're just in the stormwater permitting world, it gets down to just, you know, putting BMPs for different pollutants, and we kind of lose this whole concept of what are we trying to achieve? We're part of the greater whole. And if we have a problem, how do we actually fix it, right? So I think there is actually a lot of thought process lesson learned in that TMDL context, right?
That's a good point. Karen. And that's something that I know we've talked about recently, Karen. And so it sounds like to me like we're in the starting days, the early days. Do you guys agree we're in the early days of this, and this is going to evolve as a topic as we move forward, whether it goes to a TMDL kind of approach and how it gets into permits? Any thoughts on that?
Let's hope so.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, we in the permitting stuff, you know, we've had, we hit a wall a little bit, and we're trying to like work together to climb over the wall. And it's not surprising when you get into litigation on permits, right, that the actual underlying regs really have a wastewater construct to them, which means there has an infrastructure bent to it, right? So it's not unsurprising at the legal level that suddenly findings sort of skew you this way. So we're trying to figure out, you know, we all know the Clean Water Act has a lot of really good stuff in it, but how do we bring the car back around the other direction, and you can still, for compliance purposes, right? Like what determines compliance, and these things that take a long time sometimes with true source control, but are the solution. How do you really pull that back in? Because we hear all the right things, but then the attorneys get involved and it kind of, the cars start to come off, no pun intended, on the car and the tires.
Lawyers, I knew lawyers would come up at some point today. Okay. Actually, on this point, hold on a second, Randy. I just wanted to follow up on that because I want to be responsive to the questions that are coming in too. Because this is a perfect opportunity. It said, the question is, are there any examples of true source control reductions for any particular pollutants being included in existing MS4 permits? Is anyone aware of that?
So for us, we have some permits in California where they have watershed management plans essentially as their compliance vehicle. And the concept is, here's all of our priority pollutant problems. Here's our plan and our BMPs to sort of address it. And there's a reasonable assurance analysis and a model that says, if we do this, we will get there. And that's where some folks have tried to use true source control. And that's back to sort of where we get into the attorney realm of how that's counted or not counted, and how the compliance has been determined or not, and why we thought we were sort of moving that way, and then are we not? But so I'll give you a sort of for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then I think about, Randy, I think about with you and Sarah on the Minnesota side, the crediting. Is that where you were going, Randy, when you get your hands ready? Okay, go for it, because I do have a couple questions for Sarah too, but this is a perfect time.
It's part of it. So the street sweeping crediting methodology was an important component to the entire source control strategy, because therein, aside from just improving the water quality, that becomes an important benefit for the regulated cities, and therefore an important incentive for them to improve their street sweeping programs and use this methodology so that they can claim credits. I was also going to say, though, where a city institutes a local ban, so we saw that originally for fertilizer and coal tar sealant in Minnesota before we moved to a statewide ban. So where a city did it and could approximately quantify the load reductions, they could have taken credit under their MS4 permits. It becomes more problematic when the ban is done at the state level, because now we have to figure out, well, do the permittees get credit for this? Because it's the state that did it. But the load reductions are still significant, And many of those load reductions are achieved in MS4 permitted cities. So it's still a live question as to how that works for regulatory credits.
Yeah, well, that's I think where things can evolve in the future. I think so. It's for MS4s, obviously, things matter more when we have a way to address them in our regulations and get credit for this. So this crediting program is great. There are a couple questions that are technical questions, Sarah, that came up that I wanted to ask, and there's two questions that are really similar. One is asking about ag loading, and the other is asking about lawn fertilizers. But the larger question, I think, is there's other background sources of phosphorus and nutrients that are coming in, especially phosphorus. I know you focused on that. How did you account for that in the research? So you're not capturing phosphorus coming from these other sources, such as ag areas or lawn fertilizer or whatnot.
Yeah, so we're not basically, because when we're thinking about trees and street sweeping, we're just focused on the phosphorus that's being moved into streets by trees. So that phosphorus originated from a variety of sources. I mean, so because that, it was in the soil, right? And the trees move it into the streets. And so presumably with the phosphorus fertilizer ban, the soils are becoming less enriched in phosphorus, which, may prevent some of that movement. But there are other sources of phosphorus into streets that, through runoff, for example, that I think we also have to be trying to tackle, so that street sweeping is not going to address. And we were working in systems that don't have much ag influence, but there still is, regardless of, even though we have this phosphorus fertilizer ban, there's still significant runoff phosphorus, and particularly during the snowmelt period, and that is not addressed by street sweeping. So.
Yeah, and just quickly, a related question, I think, is there a threshold of residential density where it becomes more significant, or as opposed to, you said there's not many rural or agricultural areas that you looked at, so I assume that there's a certain amount of density where it becomes a significant loading pattern and rate, and that's the question that's coming in.
Yeah, so there's a couple things to say about that, I think. So we definitely, across like all of these watersheds that we've been studying, so I showed that graph from Ben Jenke's paper. Street density is actually the other big predictor of phosphorus runoff, and so there's not a threshold relationship. It's sort of a
linear
it's an exponential relationship. But definitely, yeah, street density is really important, and it kind of interacts with tree canopy cover. So at a given tree canopy cover, if you have higher street density, you're going to get more phosphorus export than if you have lower tree canopy cover. So
okay.
I don't know if that answers the question.
It's related. Street density and residential density are similar. So there is a density kind of aspect to it, but it's more street related than that.
And also,
okay.
Yeah, and also so street density, and then also, yeah, residential land use is the land use that we see the most phosphorus being exported from compared to commercial and industrial.
That makes sense. We got a couple of minutes left. Heather, I wanted to ask you, I know that you're involved in EPA in your role, really focusing on transportation. So I was wondering about the discussion about microplastics in tires that Karen has brought up a couple times. Any thoughts about what's going on there, either EPA or broader than that? And again, we only have a minute or two, so sorry about that, but that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that Karen was able to participate in one of those discussions. So we worked with the Trash Free Waters program to bring together, stakeholder roundtables with lots of different folks. And I think we're still kind of in the early information gathering stages here, thinking about, tire particles and all, writ large. So not any particular pollutant, but knowing that there are some pollutants associated with those, and thinking about, what are the opportunities for EPA here, where we have, we can use our superpowers, I guess you could say, as far as, information and outreach or convening, or what are the other kinds of things that we can do to kind of move forward on trying to reduce the problem of microplastics derived from tire particles. So I would say that's still in the early stages, and we've learned a lot of really interesting things that are going on from various stakeholders at the meetings.
Excellent. So that sounds like that's just the start of the ongoing dialogue, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and just a quick note that NMSA has been working with the Trash Free Waters program, focused on the area of stormwater and trash, more on the macro side of our gross solids, and we'll be releasing a report that focuses on our engagement together and some findings from that too. So we'll be sharing that in the near future. So I want to say thank you to everyone that was involved, all the panelists and the speakers. Thank you for joining us today. Again, this is a very big topic, lots of ground to cover. And as we've talked about, this is the first in a series on this topic. We don't have anything scheduled as of yet, but we will be making announcements in the future when that happens. And again, if there's any interest on PDHs and whatnot, the information is up there. And we'd love to hear from you also if there's any interest in being part of the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up and say have a great rest of your day, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.